Hey everybody, we got a big announcement at the end of the episode after the main segment, so be sure you stick around after the main segment to hear this big announcement. Let's get into the show.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the Serial Mormon History Podcast. It was January of 1844. Little snowflakes fell to the Mississippi before disappearing into the vast body of moving water. Some of the snow accumulated to about 4 inches deep, which made for good sleighing. The Mormons in Nauvoo were largely held up in their homes near the hearth to keep the cold from settling in their bones. Olive Amanda Fullmer Smith, a bright-eyed 18-year-old girl who was born in Onondaga County, New York, and immigrated to Hancock County, Illinois as a teenager, was about to give birth to a beautiful baby boy, Chauncey Harvey Cook. Her midwife bustled about the house, keeping young Olive calm and comfortable, administering medicine and massaging her tired muscles from the labor and, keeping blood flowing to stave off the frigid air coming through the cracks in the cabin logs. Little Chauncey was a healthy boy when he was delivered. Olive was strong and made it through the labor with the expert help of her midwife. However, there was a problem. Olive's partner, Milton Cook, a cavalier and good-looking 22-year-old man, didn't want to be a father. The two had met earlier in Nauvoo and fell madly in love. However, some issues must have existed between the two. They soon ran away from both of their families, and the historical record doesn't tell us if they ever married or not, but little Chauncey Harvey Cook was the result of their escapade. Apparently, Olive's stepfather didn't approve of Milton and Olive's marriage, and in these Victorian times, a father's blessing held the power in granting permission for marriage. Regardless of whether or not Olive and Milton Cook were married, when little Chauncey was born, Milton Cook ran away from his culturally expected fatherly duties. Olive swore out an affidavit against Milton, charging him with bastardy, the ye olde charge of abandonment. Olive's affidavit was given to a sheriff in Nauvoo by the name of Horace Eldridge, who carried it to Carthage, where Milton lived, and attempted to arrest Milton on the bastardy charges and bring him before the Nauvoo Municipal Court. Milton Cook was not a Mormon and really didn't like Joseph Smith and his criminal empire. He thought he'd be safe in Carthage from the Nauvoo criminal justice system. He wasn't wrong, and a confrontation ensued. Before we get to that confrontation, it's a good idea to get some sense of what the relationship between Carthage and Nauvoo was at this point. Carthage citizens hated the Mormons. Carthage was the largest town in Hancock County that wasn't Nauvoo, meaning the citizens of Carthage fell under the jurisdiction of any politicians who were elected by the Mormon voting bloc. The Mormons completely suffocated the political voice of Carthage. Beyond that, the Mormons weren't great neighbors, and they often didn't pay their bills. Carthage citizens also fell under the jurisdiction of the ever-expanding legal powers of the Nauvoo Municipal Court System and the Nauvoo Legion, not by any law or legal precedent, but simply by virtue of both of those systems slowly growing since their inception. In order to combat the expansion of the Mormon Empire, the anti-Mormon political party was formed in Carthage, Illinois in 1841 by Thomas Coke Sharp and other concerned citizens from Carthage and the surrounding cities. Carthage was literally the headquarters of the anti-Mormon political party, and where much of the anti-Mormon rhetoric was born before Thomas Sharp published that rhetoric in the Warsaw Signal, his paper. Carthage had also harbored many fugitives from Nauvoo justice in the past. Most prominently, when John C. Reckitt Bennett resigned from mayor and began collecting affidavits to publish against Joseph Smith, many of his days were spent in Carthage because it was the nearest city to Nauvoo where he could be reasonably safe from the Danites. Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell still confronted Bennett there in Carthage, but because Bennett was under the safety of the Carthage system, he remained safe. Many people who will play into the weeks prior to and following the Carthage assassination of Joe and Hiram Smith were residents of Carthage. Not only does the assassination itself happen there, but most of the prominent figures leading up to the assassinations and those charged with conspiracy of committing the murders afterwards were from Carthage. Simply put, Carthage and Nauvoo were enemy cities. Nauvoo considered Carthage to be the hotbed of their persecution, while Carthage considered Nauvoo to be the hotbed of the overreaching Mormon Empire's power. Carthage didn't consider themselves subject to the legal powers of Nauvoo, which is kind of fair because the Nauvoo municipal powers were just that. They were municipal. So, with Olive filing the affidavit against her partner, Milton Cook, and the Mormon Sheriff traveling from Nauvoo to Carthage to arrest Milton, kind of put these conflicting powers at an impasse. Nauvoo empiric overreach was an unstoppable force which met with the unmovable object of Carthaginian hatred for the Mormons. Nothing would reduce these tensions, and the hands of Governor Thomas Ford were completely tied. Milton Cook's fleeing to Carthage to escape his fatherly duties put him square in the crosshairs of this tension between these two rival cities. Historian Amanda Smith summarized the situation in the book Revelation, Resistance, and Mormon Polygamy. Quote, Olive Amanda Smith, later Fullmer, became one catalyst for an escalation of violence between Mormons and non-Mormons. Her story shows how everyday problems that ordinarily would have been solved without much fuss contributed to the tension between the two groups in 1844. Milton Cook was not a Mormon, but he lived near Nauvoo in Carthage, Illinois. After Olive gave birth to Chauncey, she obtained an affidavit for Milton's arrest so that he could be brought before a Nauvoo judge and forced to provide support for his child. Sheriff Horace Eldridge was dispatched to Carthage to arrest Milton Cook. Carthage residents may have sympathized with Olive's plight in ordinary times, but these were not normal ones. End quote. Indeed, these were not normal times. The chaos created by the Nauvoo Mormon Empire was something that regular American citizens had never really dealt with. The citizens of Carthage took any action by the Nauvoo police officer or a Nauvoo militiaman outside of the city of Nauvoo as an affront to their own sovereignty, and they reacted harshly to Sheriff Horace Eldridge coming into Nauvoo to serve this arrest warrant. Now, to be clear, Milton Cook and the charge of bastardy against him had absolutely nothing to do with the citizens of Carthage. However, a Nauvoo sheriff strutting into town and attempting to flaunt his Nauvoo-based authority made it certain that the city took an interest in Milton Cook and his opposition to the Mormons trying to bring him to justice. So in the first week of January 1844, Sheriff Horace Eldridge set out from Nauvoo on the 26-mile journey to Carthage with Olive's affidavit and an arrest warrant granted by Robert Bob the Builder D. Foster in hand. Horace Eldridge arrived in Carthage on the 6th of January. He found his target, Milton Cook, at Bartlett's grocery store in Carthage. A few of the Carthage citizens recognized Sheriff Eldridge as the Mormon Sheriff and made it known to him that he wasn't welcome in the town. When Eldridge attempted to grab Milton Cook by the arm and take him out of the grocery store, a group of Carthaginians quickly gathered. Hard words were thrown at Sheriff Eldridge, but no real violence broke out, just threats of violence. The citizens of Carthage didn't know why Eldridge wanted Milton Cook or why he was attempting to arrest him in the first place. They just knew that a Mormon sheriff was trying to arrest one of their friends and fellow citizens of Carthage. And the Carthaginians brandished firearms at Sheriff Eldridge. Milton Cook himself pulled out his own pistol, pointing it at the Sheriff Eldridge, and told him, quote, he had it loaded for the purpose and would make a hole through the constable if he molested him, and swore he would not be taken, end quote. At this point, Sheriff Eldridge knew if he further attempted to effect this arrest, surrounded by armed Carthaginian anti-Mormons, while his target was also armed, he would forfeit his life. He decided it best to return to Nauvoo with the arrest warrant unserved and come back to Carthage with reinforcements. When Sheriff Eldridge returned to Nauvoo, he told Joe and the leading policeman of the city of the confrontation that he just experienced at Carthage. Stephen Markham, one of Joe's closest advisors and personal bodyguards and head of a division of the Nauvoo police force, was quick to respond. Now, Stephen Markham wasn't, he was somebody that you did not want to mess with, okay? A long time ago, we introduced Stephen Markham to the storyline as Piggy Bank Steve because he was the primary guy with the church's purse when they were buying up all of the property in Illinois and Iowa during the Mormon resettlement following the Missouri Mormon War of 1838. Stephen Markham was so trusted by the prophet that he was specifically appointed to personally escort the Smith family from far west Missouri to Quincy, Illinois during that exodus in early 1839. Markham was also Joe's personal assistant when Joe was arrested in Dixon, Illinois in spring of 1843, which would have resulted in Joe's removal to Missouri had Markham not ridden the 160 miles to Nauvoo and notified the Nauvoo Legion of the prophet's arrest. During the arrest itself, Markham attempted to subdue Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds as they were handcuffing the prophet, but Markham relented when Joe told him to stand down. Markham was also a lieutenant colonel in the Nauvoo Legion. All of that means that Stephen Markham stepping up to help Sheriff Eldridge made this arrest, it meant business, right? This arrest was going to be effected by any means necessary. So Stephen Markham gathered a posse, including Robert D., Bob the Builder Foster, and 10 other guys. Come hell or high water, this posse was going to arrest Milton Cook. So they left Nauvoo the morning of January 8th, 1844, and arrived in Carthage in the late evening. It was an entire day's journey, so they went to Bartlett's store expecting Milton Cook to be there as he was when Eldridge alone tried to arrest him. As this posse of Mormons entered the city, their presence immediately put everybody on edge. The same people who had rallied around Cook just 2 days prior saw an entire posse of a dozen men enter the city limits, undoubtedly up to no good in their eyes, and it was time to draw a line on the Mormon power. The Mormon posse arrived at Bartlett's grocer. 5 men stood at the door of the grocer. They had 2 pistols, all of them had knives, and they also had 2 rifles with bayonets attached to them. Stephen Markham told the armed men that they were here for Milton Cook and that they intended to serve the arrest warrant. The 5 men stood at the door with their weapons, ready to defend Milton Cook. Stephen Markham caught sight of the posse inside the grocery around Cook. The anti-Mormons were 20 men strong, and Markham only brought 11 of his buddies to this fight. Markham and another member of the Mormon posse, a guy named Eagle, got in the faces of the guards, and they showed them the arrest warrant for Milton Cook. But the Carthage posse refused to give up Cook. Then Markham and that guy named Eagle stepped forward to try and push their way into the store and take Milton Cook by force. When they did this, one of the men with the bayoneted rifle thrust the weapon at Markham, but Markham, being an experienced member of the Nauvoo Legion, parried the attack with his hands, which sent the bayonet stab away from him and straight towards Eagle. Now, Mr. Eagle tried to deflect the bayonet thrust and stepped to the side. So the knife on the end of this rifle cut his hand open, and then it thrust into his abdomen. But because he sidestepped, that made the blade glance off of his stomach, leaving only a small cut and a little bit of torn clothing. Now, this aggression by the Carthaginian was met by the whole Mormon posse pushing towards the door to defend Eagle and Markham from this bayonet thrust. Another man in the Carthage posse brandished a pistol and aimed it straight at the chest of Eagle, telling him that he'd shoot if the man came any closer. A second pistol came out, which was pointed at Stephen Markham, but Markham was quick on his feet and he grabbed the gun out of the man's hands before the guy could pull the trigger. The Mormon posse continued to try and push into the grocer to arrest Cook. But the problem was they were outnumbered and they were outgunned, and Cook wasn't going to give up without his fellow Carthage citizens engaging in a real fight. But nobody wanted to pull the trigger. You see, the Mormon posse was outgunned and outnumbered in this little confrontation, but the underlying tension in this standoff was the Nauvoo Legion. Sure, the Legion wasn't here for this fight specifically, but if the Carthaginians did anything to the Mormon posse beyond threats and a few bayonet stabs, that would undoubtedly bring the whole Nauvoo Legion down upon the city. The Mormon militia was looking for a reason to be utilized, and the Carthage mob protecting a fugitive from Nauvoo justice was a great excuse for the Mormons to march on their rival city of Carthage. This fight was bigger than 25 men yelling at each other and, pistols being brandished and pointed at each other. This fight carried with it the weight of 3,000 soldiers and the end to Carthage life as the citizens knew it. Milton Cook and some members of the posse realized this fight was escalating, and the end of it meant, Carthage being razed to ashes before the Nauvoo Legion salted the earth on which the city once stood. Milton Cook and a few of the posse guarding him decided to slip out the back door during the chaos and the confusion. One of the Carthage posse told the Mormon posse that Milton Cook isn't here and that their fight was in vain. This released some of the tension because the catalyst for the fight was no longer in the building. Where could he have gone? There wasn't really a town nearby for him to run to, and it was late in the evening anyway. The apathy from the Mormons, obviously weary from their travels, and the Carthaginians drunk and not wanting to deal with the Mormon posse, coalesced to de-escalating the tensions. Markham and Eldridge decided it would be best to spend the night at the local Carthage tavern and attempt to arrest Cook in the morning. He would certainly remain in the city overnight, and everybody would be fresh, and they'd be able to keep their heads cool and come to a reasonable agreement tomorrow morning, right? So the Mormon posse retired, with the promise that this affair was far from over. The next morning, the Mormon posse again returned to Bartlett's Grocer, now for the third time, suspecting that Milton Cook was there, where they could finally arrest him once and for all. They were wrong. When they got to the store, a few of the Carthage posse from the previous day told them that Milton Cook had fled in the night and he wasn't even in town anymore. The Mormon posse chose to check another common gathering place which had a group of armed men gathered around it. This was another grocer owned by Harmon T. Wilson, who was one of the sheriffs who arrested Joe in Dixon in June of 1843. What an interesting turn of events for this guy, right? So the Carthage posse had grown overnight. What used to be a mob of 20 men armed with a couple of pistols and rifles was now 50 men strong, armed with, quote, guns, bayonets, pistols, clubs, and other missiles, end quote. Milton Cook was, indeed, at Wilson's store, guarded by these 50 men. The Mormon posse pulled up to Wilson's store, where the Carthage posse had all of their weapons brandished and ready to use. All of the tensions from the previous evening were suddenly amplified by the larger numbers of defending Carthaginians. Sheriff Eldridge demanded Milton Cook in a raised voice, with Stephen Markham and the other 10 Nauvoo Legionnaires ready for a fight behind him. Eldridge pushed past the Carthage mob and grabbed Milton Cook by the collar. This was a moment of tough decision for the Carthaginians, right? Do they cede control of the situation and acquiesce to Eldridge's authority and allow their friend and fellow Carthage citizen Milton Cook to be arrested, thus allowing the Mormons to chalk this up to a win against the Carthage system of law? What kind of a precedent does that set? Or do they oppose Eldridge, have a fight, and oppose the entire Mormon posse and stand up to the ever-growing Mormon power, even if fighting now results in the Nauvoo Legion marching into town ready for war in the following days? Well, they chose the latter. Let consequences be damned. As soon as Eldridge grabbed Milton Cook by the collar, 8 men grabbed Eldridge and pried Cook out of his hands. Stephen Markham stepped forward to assist his fellow brother in the Nauvoo criminal justice system. Seeing Markham go to help Eldridge, a Carthaginian named Dr. Morrison pulled out his pistol and aimed it at Stephen Markham. The whole crowd jumped into the fray and a brawl ensued. Morrison pulled the trigger on his pistol, but Stephen Markham reacted quickly again and deflected the shot from hitting him. The gun did fire, and the pistol ball grazed the head of Zebedee Coltrane, a Mormon Danite from the Kirtland era, and lodged into the ceiling above the fight. The gunshot was a wake-up call, and the Mormon posse halted their actions for fear that more guns may go off. The 3 Mormons who'd made their way through the mob into the store and were trying to get Milton Cook under control stopped what they were doing and reluctantly let go of the prisoner. The fight was over without any serious wounds. The Mormons were beat. The Nauvoo posse pulled away from the storefront, realizing, quote, it would be impossible to take Cook without bloodshed, and consequently returned home, end quote. As the Mormons mounted their horses, one of the Mormon posse, possibly Stephen Markham, parted with this terrifying reply, signaling to the Carthaginians that they had made a horrible mistake defending Milton Cook. Quote, we will return with the legion and take the prisoner or lay the town in ashes, end quote. The worst fears of the worst possible outcome of this brawl were now realized by the Carthaginians. But, of course, this was the result. The Mormons lost the fight. Now, the Carthaginians had the entire Nauvoo Legion to fear. So the posse made their way back to Nauvoo, where Stephen Markham immediately made an affidavit of his perspective of the events, which was published in the Nauvoo Neighbor of January 10th. The citizens of Carthage also sent word to Thomas Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Signal turned Warsaw Message, soon to turn Warsaw Signal again. That was the leading anti-Mormon paper, and Thomas Sharp printed a small report on the same day. From the content of the report, it's clear that conflicting stories made their way to the respective propaganda outlets. From the Nauvoo Neighbor, quote, we think that it is high time that prompt measures be taken to put a stop to such abominable outrages. If officers can be insulted in this manner and the law violated with impunity, we think that we shall speedily slide back into the barbarous ages. If such proceedings as those are cherished, farewell to our republican institutions, farewell to law, equity, and justice, and farewell to all those sacred ties that bind men to their fellow men, end quote. The Warsaw Message, in its usual tone of skepticism and seeking further information, quote, we learned that there was quite an excitement at Carthage yesterday in consequence of the arrest of a citizen of that place by a posse of Mormons from Nauvoo on the charge of bastardy. The citizens declare that the individual shall not be taken to Nauvoo for trial and were under arms in his defense. We do not hear that any fighting was done. The excitement ran high and may yet result in bloodshed. We hear no further particulars. It is hoped that our citizens will exercise moderation in these scenes of strife, and on all occasions make it a paramount duty to support the supremacy of the law. Let others disobey the law and receive the consequences, but the anti-Mormon party should ever make the law their shield and their hope, end quote. So stepping back a bit, this was a really tough situation, right? The arrest warrant for Milton Cook was legitimate, and Carthage was in Hancock County, where the Nauvoo Sheriff actually sort of had jurisdiction to exercise criminal justice. Robert D. Bob the Builder Foster was a legitimate justice of the peace who signed the affidavit from Olive Amanda Fullmer Smith in the first place, and who wrote the arrest warrant based on her affidavit. The Mormon posse was operating under the color of law, albeit in some kind of gray zones. However, in so many circumstances, the Mormon criminal justice system worked on behalf of criminals. The Nauvoo Municipal Court had shielded thieves, it let murderers roam free, and had protected the criminal kingpin Joseph Smith himself for nearly half a decade when he was dead to rights under any normal system of law for the crimes that he had committed in Missouri. The Carthaginians felt justified in opposing the Nauvoo posse because they were tired of the constant scandals and outrage Joe was putting them through daily. They were Americans beholden to the same American Constitution and criminal justice code. Joseph Smith and his cronies claimed that they followed the same laws as every other American, but such adherence to that system of law had never been demonstrated. The Mormons, especially the Mormon leadership, lived under the law of the Lord, and they followed Joseph Smith's rules. Joe made the laws, he made the rules, and those who didn't play by his rules suffered the consequences of the legal system Joseph had demonstrated himself exempt from. This wonderful paradox makes this scuffle between the Mormons and the Carthaginians so wonderfully interesting to me. For once, the Mormons were actually following the law while the anti-Mormons were violating the due process of the criminal justice system. That equation was flipped in nearly every other circumstance which drew these cities together, but in this unique case, the Mormons happened to be on the right side of the law. This paradox was recognized by Thomas Sharp, the editor of the Warsaw Signal, as more information about the outrage trickled in, and he continued to report on it. In an illustration of remarkable restraint, the Warsaw Message called for a meeting between the Mormons and the anti-Mormons in order to bury the hatchet and hash out what had happened during the fight and figure out if Milton Cook should face the law in Nauvoo or if Milton Cook should remain in Carthage unmolested. Of course, the editor of the Warsaw Message, Thomas Sharp, was still very clear about drawing the line against the tyrant himself, Joseph Smith, merely calling for the good citizens involved in the brawl to come to an understanding. Thomas Sharp gives Mormons the benefit of the doubt that even they can be sensible about this situation, even if Joe himself would never be sensible or seek compromise. Quote, "In view of these things, the question occurs to us whether there is not some common ground on which the two parties can meet. This is not for the hoary monster, Joseph Smith, who rules at Nauvoo, whose black heart would exult in carnage and bloodshed rather than yield one iota of that power he had obtained by his hellish knavery. We feel sure that a majority even of his most firm supporters would prefer peace and quietness to rapine and violence. To all such, to all who are not determined to rush headlong to destruction in carrying out the villainous designs of Smith, we appeal to meet their fellow citizens in a spirit of concession and compromise. And to the old citizens of the county, we would urgently appeal to meet them on the same ground. As a means of bringing about so desirable a result, we respectfully suggest that a public meeting of all parties be called to meet at Carthage on as early a day as practicable to take into consideration the grievances and their remedy. What say you, fellow citizens?" That was an open petition by Thomas Sharp to receive all sorts of incredible letters from readers of the Warsaw Message, some of which he was kind enough to print in subsequent editions covering this quote-unquote great excitement at Carthage. Now, I have to remark on Thomas Sharp's ability to dissociate the Mormons from Joseph Smith in this article and the following columns. You see, Sharp hated Joseph Smith, but clearly saw the Mormons collectively as otherwise rational people who had been victimized by the prophet. To draw that line of distinction and refuse to villainize the entire Mormon population, that was a laudable stance for Sharp to take, and he was literally one of the founders of the anti-Mormon political party. It's not that people were anti-Mormon, they were anti-Joseph Smith. They were anti-tyrant. The Warsaw Message continued its tirade against the Nauvoo neighbor, considering what happened during the brawl between the two posses. Quote, "The Nauvoo neighbor, as is usual with that print on such occasions, comes out with a long rigmarole of untruth about the affair at Carthage last week between the citizens and the Mormons. The facts as they occurred were about as follows." Now, this is, of course, the facts from the Carthaginian side. So the story as I recounted it was all from Stephen Markham himself, recounted from the Mormon side. This is what the Carthaginians are saying. Quote, "A constable from Nauvoo went to Carthage on Saturday and arrested one Milton Cook on a charge of bastardy before reaching the justice. But whether before they left Carthage or not, we did not learn. The prisoner made his escape from the officer. In the meantime, some of the citizens turned out to defend Cook, declaring that he should not be taken to Nauvoo for trial, but offered no resistance to a hearing before any other magistrate. That's an important detail that is not present in the Mormon account, that Milton Cook understood that there was a charge of bastardy filed against him, that he was willing to be heard in front of any other judge, but he did not want to go to the Nauvoo municipal court system because it was a kangaroo court, right? The officer, seeing that he could not succeed in his attempt, returned to the justice who issued the writ, who summoned 11 men to his assistance. With this reinforcement, he returned on Monday night, when 3 or 4 of the party attacked Mr. Bartlett's grocery, in which Cook was supposed to be. They were met at the door with 5 or 6 bayonets firmly grasped, and it appeared that one Mr. Eagle had no more prudence than to rush violently against one of them and get himself hurt. Thus repulsed, the party retired for the night. In the morning, it would seem, as by accident, the parties again met at Wilson's store. Considerable confusion and violence prevailed for a moment, when the pistol of Dr. Morrison, as he was attempting to draw it from his pocket, was accidentally discharged. The ball, instead of striking one of the officers' party in the forehead and glancing off again to the imminent danger of the hole, as the neighbor has it, passed very near the doctor's own head and lodged in the ceiling. No pistol was intentionally fired and no bayonet plunged at the breast of any of the assailants during the whole affray. The combatants now separated. The constable and his posse set out for Nauvoo, declaring that they would return with the Legion and take the prisoner or lay the town in ashes. The above are substantially the facts of the case. We leave our readers to make their own comments." End quote. What actually happened between the two groups, obviously, is a subject of debate. The sequence of events reported by Stephen Markham doesn't necessarily match with what the citizens of Carthage reported, but of course, we wouldn't expect these sequence of events to match up, because both sides viewed themselves as the correct party and the other side as the aggressors in this fight. So the meeting to determine the facts and to draft resolutions did happen according to the request of the Warsaw Message. But it seems if any Mormons did attend this, that they were probably very few in number. The Warsaw Message of 17th January 1844 reports the general tone and the resolutions which were passed at the meeting in view of the quote-unquote Mormon difficulties resulting from everything that we've discussed on the show so far today. Quote, "Meeting of citizens at Carthage. At a large and respectable meeting of the citizens of Hancock County held in the courthouse in Carthage on Wednesday the 10th of January 1844, the objects of the meeting having been stated by the chairman on motion, it was decided that Valentine Wilson address the meeting, which he accordingly did in an appropriate and eloquent speech, after which it was moved and decided that the chairman appoint a committee of 3 to draft resolutions expressive of the sense of the meeting in regard to certain difficulties with the community of people called Mormons. The chair named Walter Bagby, Colonel Levi Williams, and Henry Newton for that committee, who reported the following preamble and resolutions which were unanimously adopted." End quote. Brief pause to talk about one of these names, Colonel Levi Williams. Back on episode 171, we talked about Daniel Avery and his son being arrested on horse thieving charges. Colonel Levi Williams was the member of the Illinois State Militia who executed that arrest and handed Avery over to Sheriff Reynolds in Missouri, where Daniel and his son were imprisoned. Colonel Levi Williams is a name that we need to keep in mind, as he is one of the most well-known anti-Mormons of this Nauvoo era. He was one of the 5 men who stood trial for the assassinations of Joe and Hiram after the Carthage shootout. He also figures heavily into the schism crisis and the removal of most of the Mormons from the state of Illinois in 1844 through 47. He was one of the people completely fed up with the Mormons who was called to this committee to draft the resolution resulting from this meeting, which reads in part, quote, "While the authorities of the city of Nauvoo have been continually passing ordinances in designation of the laws and constitution of the state of Illinois and of the United States calculated, if carried into effect, to be a source of galling oppression to the citizens of this county, Carthaginians, and indeed to all who may be so unfortunate as to be placed under their operation, which laws have been in many cases executed upon individuals to the great detriment and annoyance. And while we have seen a growing disposition on the part of that community, and especially of their leader, the most potent Joseph Smith, to harass us by dragging our citizens from the most remote parts of this county to Nauvoo to be tried for every petty offense, and when they're to be subjected to all the indignities that the said Smith, the most foul-mouthed blackguard that ever was commissioned by Satan to vex and torment the children of men, could invent. And while we have been threatened, vilified, and abused in every possible form and manner, insomuch that we are driven to the conclusion that there is no alternative now left us but the most abject and ignominious resistance, still we desire to hold ourselves responsible to the laws of the country, so far as they are reasonably administered, and will at all times cheerfully submit to be tried by officers of our immediate vicinage, yet resolved, that seeing that we have been constrained to believe that the authorities of Nauvoo, by a succession of the most extraordinary ordinances that were ever known to be passed by a deliberating body designed to bar themselves against the just and equitable operation of the laws, as well as by many other indications too numerous here to name, we hereby determine and pledge to each other our sacred honor and all our substance, so far as it may be needed, to resist every oppression that may be attempted to be imposed upon us, and every indignity that may be offered to any individual or community in this county or the surrounding counties by the authorities of Nauvoo at the point of a bayonet. Resolved, that we pledge ourselves most solemnly that we will at all times hold ourselves in readiness to march at a moment's warning to any point to which we may be called. Resolved, that each and every one of us will use our influence and best exertions to induce those of our immediate neighborhood to engage heartily in the work by organizing themselves into defensive bodies, that we may be at all times prepared for an emergency. A Carthage militia. That's what this resolution is. Resolved that the editor of the Warsaw Message be requested to publish in his paper the proceedings of this meeting. End quote. Essentially, resolved, we're tired of getting kicked around by the damn Mormons and we're forming our own militia to oppose them. That's what this is. So the Carthaginians agreed that they will stand against the Mormons at all costs and form defensive bodies should any Mormon threat come into Carthage, as was threatened by a member of the Nauvoo posse as they rode away without having successfully executed the arrest warrant for Milton Cook. You see, the collective mentality that created these resolutions is the exact same mentality by the exact same people that actually killed Joseph and Hiram Smith only 6 months after this meeting. That's why this fight and this confrontation that we're discussing today is so important. It's not like the Carthaginians just marched on the Carthage jail where the men were interred in a vacuum. The Carthaginians have been dealing with the injustices of the Mormon Empire for years, and they were done. It's also important to recognize that these people clearly understood it was Joseph Smith who was the problem, not the Mormons at large. The resolutions and ordinances passed by the Nauvoo government had all been done at the behest of and for the benefit of Joseph Smith. He was the corrupter that was dragging an otherwise industrious and good people to the depths of, quote, blackguard commissioned by Satan to vex and torment the children of men, end quote. Joseph Smith, as has been the case since we started this podcast, was the issue here, not the beliefs or practices of the Mormons. The resolutions were designed to be defensive and immediately published in the Warsaw Signal. But a few folks living in Carthage decided to answer the editor's call for input about the meeting and the fight, which led to the meeting with letters to the editor. Now, there were two actual editors of the Warsaw Message. There was Thomas Gregg and there was Thomas Sharp. Thomas Sharp was the primary writer, but Mr. Gregg acted as the senior editor. So these letters are published to Mr. Gregg. Quote, Mr. Gregg, in your paper published on the 10th instant, we find some remarks on the difficulties which occurred between the Carthaginians and the Mormons on Monday and Tuesday last, in which I think may be seen a strong squinting at a disposition to compromise with that people. Your closing paragraph runs thus, now quoting the previous article, quote, as a means of bringing about so desirable a result, we respectfully suggest that a public meeting of all parties be called to meet at Carthage on as early a day as practicable to take into consideration the grievances and their remedy. What say you, fellow citizens? Now back to this person who is writing the letter to the editor. As for one, I say, no, never. Just as well might you call upon us to strike hands with pirates or to compromise with the powers of darkness. Who is there amongst us so wanting in discrimination as not to be able to see that a community constructed as is that at Nauvoo, headed by a leader so destitute of every moral principle as we know Joe Smith to be, can be trusted? Obeying a leader most implicitly who, in their very midst, has committed so long a catalog of the most abominable acts of which the imagination of man can conceive, attempting at the same time to cloak all his outrages under the sacred garb of a religion, and that too the pure and holy religion of Jesus Christ? In view of such wonderful presumption, I am constrained to cry out, "Oh, blasphemous wretch, who can trust him?" I repeat it so emphatically, let no such man be trusted. I again answer, I can make no compromise with Nauvoo as a community while it avows allegiance to the beast and the false prophet. If there are those, as you suggest, who would be willing to rid themselves and the country of the evils growing out of the mad projects of that presumptuous wretch, let them show their faith by works and come out and disabuse themselves of the odium which cleaves to them like the fatal shirt of Nessus, and that will suffice me. For I hold that the little philosophy which I can lay claim to has never yet taught me that when I see a thief and other partakers with him, that these less can be honest men. No, sir, I can never compromise with Joe Smith, nor yet a community who consider his will as their pleasure, no matter how absurd. And more especially, cannot I compromise with Joe Smith until I shall have seen his inflated vanity and his intolerable audacity humbled and subdued. I have seen too much of his treachery and felt too much of his dastardly tyranny when in the plenitude of his power he expected no resistance. Who, then, in view of such a being, but with the full assurance that so soon as he shall have found himself in a situation to crush them with impunity, that he will not withhold his hand for a moment? These are my feelings. They are the feelings of one who presumes to subscribe to himself. Signed, Hannibal. End quote. You can't trust a Mormon. That was the central point of his letter to the editor. But, signing himself as Hannibal is actually quite remarkable here because, from the classical era, Hannibal Barca was one of the most successful Carthaginian military leaders to fight Rome during the Second Punic War. Somehow, Hannibal successfully crossed the Alps and infiltrated Italy and proceeded to burn Roman cities in their homeland. Hannibal was so close to successfully defeating the Romans over 400 years before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, I should clarify. But unfortunately, Hannibal failed in his military campaign, arguably because he didn't receive reinforcements from Carthage at crucial times in his warpath, which eventually led to the fall of Carthage when the Romans raided, pillaged, and burned the city to the ground, leveling every structure and then salting the ground on which the city stood to ensure that it would never be inhabited again. This guy signing himself Hannibal was a history deep cut, but given the mentality of the anti-Mormon Carthaginians and the ever-expanding Mormon Empire, well, let's just say maybe it's not an unfitting name to invoke given the difficulties between the Holy Mormon Empire and the Carthaginians who were opposing it. So Thomas Sharp, or Thomas Gregg, one of the editors of the Warsaw Message, decided to comment on this letter with a rare display of complete restraint and trying to diffuse the situations while many citizens like this Hannibal character were crying for bloodshed. Once again, I applaud the editor's ability to separate Joseph Smith from his deluded followers. Joe was the problem here, and he was not a person to compromise with. The Mormons at large, however, could be reasoned with. At least that's what the editor thought. Quote, "We are glad that our query has brought so prompt an answer, though so unfavorable to our own views. One has spoken, and he has spoken no doubt the sentiments of many, and we desire a further expression on the part of our citizens. Our columns are always open to well-tempered articles on a subject so momentum. Again, we ask fellow citizens, what say you? We acknowledge that, in view of all the circumstances regarding the high state of excitement which has been produced upon the public mind, the danger there is of collision and bloodshed and consequent misery and ruin and death to hundreds of innocent people, in view of all these things, we have a strong squinting at compromise. Rather than do worse, we would strike hands with pirates or compromise with the powers of darkness, so far, at least, as to agree to a system of non-intercourse. We would not compromise with Joe Smith one inch, in the acknowledgement of his right to plunder and destroy and tyrannize and dupe as he is doing, or that he is anything short of a demon in human shape sent to scourge mankind. But we do believe that there are 10 righteous persons in the city, yet 50 times 10, who are innocent of any intention to do wrong. And shall they too suffer? Shall there be no discrimination made between these, and that ruthless and guilty band who disregard all law and all right? Shall all be made to suffer alike, the innocent and the guilty? God forbid! We see no use in attempting to disguise the fact that many in our midst contemplate a total extermination of that people, that the thousands of defenseless women and children, aged and infirmed, who are congregated at Nauvoo must be driven out, scattered like the leaves before the autumn blast. But what good citizen, let us ask, what lover of his country and his race, but contemplates such an event with honor? Shall not, we would ask, shall not the olive branch be least held out to those innocent though deluded followers of the prophet? Shall not an attempt be made to set them right in reference to the designs and aims of those whom they have heretofore been taught to regard as their worst enemies? It's extending an olive branch. Let's help the Mormons. We hate Joseph Smith, but let's help the Mormons. They're deluded. Should everybody suffer for the wrongs of one guy? It continues. We still persist in the opinion that a compromise may be entered into that will do much good, that will in its operation entirely stay the work of destruction, and we call upon all our fellow citizens to aid in bringing about such a compromise." End quote. Then another citizen chose to chime in after what we just read was published. Quote, "Mr. Gregg, I have been a silent observer of what has been done and said for some time, though not feeling myself qualified to say anything that would be profitable on the important subject before the people. Notwithstanding, I see you invite the attention of people to the question of compromise. And as an old citizen whose rights and liberties have been trampled underfoot and who loves and highly esteems the old citizens of this county, I feel opposed to a compromise in any shape whatever. We notice an article in your paper of the 10th instant in which you say, we feel sure that a majority even of his most firm supporters would prefer peace and quietness to rapine and violence. Now, sir, I do not know what ground you have to think so. We see and know that those very individuals will go any length, even they will hazard their lives for Joe and his measures. Our conclusions have been the result of deliberate reflection, not made in frenzied excitement, and those reflections are briefly these. That, as a people, we have every reason to look upon them as a band of knaves or highway robbers who, as I said, are willing to hazard their lives to carry out what you call Joe's hellish designs. And as proof of this, let us notice many of their publications, among which is a statement of the Carthage difficulty made by Markham, a man in whom they say they can rely, which statement we pronounce basely false. And that is not all. We see that by their knavish and tyrannical conduct that they have been compelled to leave every place they have lived in yet, except this, and from their conduct here, I think they deserve to live among no civilized people. That's an interesting point, isn't it? Everywhere the Mormons have lived, they've been kicked out. I believe that they shouldn't be allowed to live among any civilized people. That's a really interesting observance, isn't it? If there are as many innocent ones as you suppose, as Hannibal says, let them show their faith by works, though I confess your faith in their innocence is just 50 times 10 as strong as mine. I think when I speak my sentiments, I speak the sentiments of many citizens. So we say anything but compromise until they humble themselves and bring forth fruits worthy of repentance. I have the honor to subscribe myself a Farmer's Guard, signed January 22nd, 1844. End quote. No compromise until the Mormons humble themselves and admit they're wrong. If that's the mentality with which you approach conflict, nobody is going to get anything done. This mentality leads to war, and it seems clear that many citizens of Carthage considered a war of extermination to be the best answer to the Mormon problem. Once again, the Warsaw Signal editor takes this citizen to task for their letter, which seems to advocate extermination. Quote, "We do not know whether to understand our correspondent as advocating the system of expelling or not, but that he is vastly mistaken in his views as to the number of persons among the Mormons innocent of crime is perfectly clear. Admit, if he please, that they are a band of knaves and robbers. That is not decisive that all who reside at Nauvoo are deserving of punishment. By no means. 1/2 of the adult population of that city are females, who necessarily associate themselves with their husbands, fathers, and brothers. How are those to come out from among their natural protectors and show their faith by works?" That's an interesting point. These women don't have any other options but to follow along with what their brothers, husbands, and fathers are doing. They continue. What would our correspondent do with these? Probably 1/2 of the whole population of the city is children under the age of 7 or 10 years, not responsible in law for their own acts. And would our friends make them responsible for those of their guilty fathers? We blush for our country and for the age in which we live to be compelled to denounce such odious, such fearful doctrines. We will go as far as anyone in bringing the real criminals to justice by the force of law. Beyond this, we cannot go. The shield, as well as the sword, is its emblem. While it punishes the guilty, it must also protect the innocent. One more word. The verdict of the American people will ever be against those who resort to force to effect their purposes. It ever has been and is now so. We rejoice that it is the case and hope that it ever may continue to be so." End quote. The main takeaway from this interaction between the Mormons and the citizens of Carthage is that this interaction, this whole fight, this brawl, was a harbinger of what the future held for these two groups of people. Sharp saying that the verdict of the American people is against those who resort to force to effect their purposes, that assertion simply cannot be further from the truth. As people, we relish violence. In the 19th century, just as much today, people are able and willing to justify violence committed against other humans. The tribalism and vilification of the other groups in today's episode is such a fascinating microcosm of what humans always do to each other. This interplay between the Carthaginians and the Mormons reveals human natures which transcend simple distinctions like religions, class, or racial divisions. Whether it was the Carthaginians and the Romans or the Carthaginians and the Mormons, violence seemed like the only possible conclusion, and violence ended up ruling the day. In spite of what people with cooler heads like Thomas Sharp was trying to calm tensions down, he was calling for a meeting for everybody to just sit down and talk this out. Cooler heads rarely prevail among those who desire the bloodshed of their enemies. You see, Thomas Sharp did the proper work of journalism here. Instead of stoking the flames like John Taylor at the Nauvoo Neighbor, Thomas Sharp's articles in the Warsaw Message were that of calling for tolerance and understanding while reporting the Carthage side of the conflict, while also recognizing the prevailing sentiments of the vast majority of Carthaginians wanting to exterminate the Mormons. You see, these two groups, they didn't want compromise. They wanted victory. Victory for Carthage was no longer having to deal with the Mormons as terrible neighbors. Victory for the Mormons was mortal deification of their great and wonderful leader as king of the world. Those two concepts simply don't work together, and compromise seemed just as impossible for the people living through this as it does for historians looking back at the conflict today. Unfortunately, the people in power at this time were largely impotent. Governor Thomas Ford, he'd done all that he thought he could do to de-escalate the conflict and have Joe answer for his crimes, and none of it worked. How could Thomas Ford step in without calling in a militia and even further escalating the conflict? There simply wasn't a human system in place that could handle this conflict between the Mormons and the Carthaginians. As much as we relish the day when Joe meets his great demise on this podcast, and as much as the people at the time who hated the prophet relished his death, Joseph Smith's death didn't actually solve anything. That singular act of violence within the context of these escalating tensions didn't actually make the world a better place for most of the people affected by Mormonism at the time. In many ways, Joe's death, and just 6 months ahead of when this fight happened, was the catalyst for so much more suffering and pain for tens of thousands of people. Violence begets violence, okay? And those involved rarely listen to a logical observer telling everybody to just calm down and talk it through. If we don't understand our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And that's going to do it for our main segment today. Like I said in the pre-roll, we got a big announcement. I know quite a few of you have been clamoring for the updated version of the Smith Entheogen paper. Well, it has now finally arrived. It is titled The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis. This is the update of the Sunstone paper that Cody and I self-published for Sunstone 2017, and now this is officially published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. You're going to find a link to the academia.edu link for the paper. If you're wanting to read through the update, it's expanded, it's greatly enhanced, it's much more in-depth, and it is co-authored with two other authors who are quite well known within this community of psychedelic studies. So, if that's something that you've been clamoring for, which I know at least two of you have been asking me for where the update is, it's now live. It is online. It is available, and you're going to find it linked up in the show notes of this week's episode. It's going to be the very first link in the show notes. Just click that, head on over, check it out. We also have some new patrons to thank over at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. It's because of all of these fantastic people who support the show that I'm able to fund the research, that you all are able to fund the research that goes into this show, but not only the show, but into writing papers, like my very first actual academic journal paper that was just published, The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis. Check it out. All right, so new patrons. We have Lauren and Luke T., the future Mrs. Enright. Ooh, does Heath know about that? Oh, all right. We also had a pledge edit from Roy, a pledge from Dave and Shay, a new pledge from Benjamin, and a brand new pledge. My goodness, Michael has introduced himself into the Nemo Outer Darkness family by becoming a demon. So thank you all to all of our patrons, to all of our longtime patrons, and to all of the new patrons. If you want to join the Nemo family, you can do that on patreon.com/Naked Mormonism, where you gain access to early extended editions of every episode. The extended editions, of course, are the variety show after the credits, where the gloves come off. I go a little NSFW. If you like the old swearing style of the show, then the Patreon feed is what you are looking for. You also get an extra episode every week. We've been reading through Mormonism Unveiled on the Patreon exclusive feed, and it has been a lot of fun. In fact, received a little bit of listener email concerning the patron exclusive Mormonism Unveiled episodes, which it's just a lot of fun. So be sure to sign up there if you want to support the show and if you want access to a whole bunch of extra content. Did want to read a couple of emails that we received over at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. First one is from Gavin. Gavin says, "Hi, Bryce. I don't know if you've ever read the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. I have not." And he goes on to say, "I'm embarrassed to say I never had until Stephen Fry did the reading of an excellent complete series of them on Audible. Having never read more than a few tidbits of them in elementary school, I was a bit taken aback to learn that Mormons generally, and Brigham Young in particular, played a pivotal role in the first novel, A Study in Scarlet. The portrayal was not favorable. I was wondering if you had ever done an episode or were aware of other ex-Mormon commentaries on Doyle's portrayal of the Brighamite Church. Thanks so much and keep up the good work. Signed, Gavin." Well, Gavin, my response to that is I have never read a Sherlock Holmes book either. I am someone who falls perfectly into the category of uncultured swine. And not only have I not read A Study in Scarlet, but I haven't read any of the other Sherlock Holmes books. Now, I will tell you, you're not the first person to mention this to me, that A Study in Scarlet includes Mormonism and Brigham Young in a role. I just have never taken the time to read it. I read very, very little fiction. But yeah, so I am not aware of anybody doing like a review of it, or, like an ex-Mormon podcast or something that talks about A Study in Scarlet. I'm sure they're out there. I have never run into one. But if listeners do, if any of you know of one, please send in a message on, social media or into nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll read it on an upcoming episode. Just in case, somebody like Gavin is interested in hearing a commentary on The Study in Scarlet through an ex-Mormon or Mormon, post-Mormon, whatever you want to call it, lens. Also had an email that came in from Tim. This is in response to episode 175, one of the episodes with Philip Amick about polygamy. And those two episodes have definitely generated a bit of discussion, but this is one that I wanted to read out really quickly. Tim says, on 175, why can not a discussion of polyamorous relationships be part of the discussion? And that is actually an interesting question, and I thoroughly agree with you, Tim, that polyamory is kind of the next step where I think that people are going to use the general progressiveness of polyamory to as an ally to the Mormon polygamy community in order to decriminalize and move society forward in accepting non-monogamous relationships. Tim concludes his email by saying, it is the kink community that will push marriage boundaries. And Tim, you're absolutely right. That has historically been the precedent. The kink communities have been the ones who have moved, to get government out of the bedroom. And they're going to continue to, move that Overton window towards more progressive and non-conventional perspectives, non-American, Protestant perspectives of marriage and of love. So good. Yes, I totally agree. And you're right. That part didn't ever come up in the conversation. Unfortunately, there was a lot that Philippa and I talked about off the air that we wish we would have been able to get into. One of which was polyamory. Another aspect was the Mann Act and how the Mann Act figured into criminalizing and policing polygamous marriages. But unfortunately, we simply ran out of time. It is understandably a massive subject. Polygamy has been something that we've dealt with extensively on the show, but not enough. Obviously, there's so much more to discuss. So go listen to A Year of Polygamy, because it's a podcast just about Mormon polygamy. I'm sure that Lindsay has talked about polyamory on her show a fair amount. Of course, I don't know, because I haven't listened to the entire backlog. So that's going to do it for our listener mail today. That's going to do it for our show today. But of course, if you're a patron, stick around. We're going to do the variety show afterwards. But of course, I want to thank everybody who stuck around for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.